Good morning to everyone, and let us start today's lecture. So, so in the last lecture, we continued looking at the definition of Turing machine. Right? We defined uh, the acceptance and rejection, the rejection criteria, right, of Turing machines. So basically say that whenever you process the string, right, on the beginning from the initial configuration, right, Turing machine, and if you reach the final state in any configuration, then the machine accepts, right. Turing machine basically accepts the string, and at that point it also halts, right, because we assume that there is no transition out of a final state, right. On the other hand, there are two rejection criteria, right. So either a Turing machine halts in a non-final state, or the Turing machine loops forever, right, without reaching a final state. So a Turing machine can reject a string through these two different means, right? And then based on these means, right, we define two classes of languages which are defined by Turing machines, right? So one is the recursively enumerable languages. So a language is recursively enumerable if there exists some Turing machine which defines that language. And we also define a second class of languages which is called recursive languages, right? So a language is recursive if there exists a total Turing machine which defines that language, right? Where this total Turing machine is guaranteed to halt on every input, irrespective of whether it accepts or rejects the input, right? So remember that in a recursively enumerable language, right? So if you begin the analysis or the execution of the Turing machine, uh, right, and if the string on a string, right, and if the string is in the language, then the Turing machine will halt. But if it is not in the language, then it may or may not halt, right? But in a recursive language, you are guaranteed that the Turing machine will always halt, right? So then we looked at so the basic question that we want to answer, right, is that are there languages which are not recursively enumerable, right? Which means that there doesn't exist any Turing machine uh, which defines that language, right? So that would so we said that Turing machine is the most powerful computing abstraction, right? Which means that if there is a language which cannot be identified by Turing machine, then that means that that language is not computable at all. And the second question that we want to answer is, are there languages which are recursively enumerable but not recursive, which means that uh, so there are no practical Turing machines, right? So in the sense that if a language is recursively enumerable but not recursive, it's not very useful, right? Because if you want to recognize a string of the language, right, you cannot just run the Turing machine, because it may never halt, right? And then you are never sure whether or not the string is in the language or not. Okay, so yeah, so in order to answer those questions, right, we need to go through some more concepts regarding Turing machine, right? So there are two. In particular, right, so we look at restrictions and we look at extensions of the Turing machine model. So in a restriction of the Turing machine model, we say that in the standard definition of Turing machine, uh, the infinite tape, right? The tape that the Turing machine has is infinite in both directions, which means that I can basically visit, right, an infinite number of positions of the tape in any direction, right? So when I say direction, I mean that you begin from so when you begin the Turing machine, right, you begin at the very first, the leftmost symbol, right, the input string, right? And then from this position, you can either move to the left or you can move to the right, for any number of squares. Okay? So that's what we mean when we say it's an infinite tape, right? So the restriction that we're looking at is that what happens if the Turing machine has a semi-infinite tape, which means that you can only move to the right from the initial position of the head. So the Turing machine can never move left from the initial position of the head. Right? So in some books, right, for example, in the Cozen book, this is how a standard Turing machine is actually defined. Right? So so in spite of this restriction, right, so this restriction is not really a meaningful restriction, right, in the sense that if you have a Turing machine which has an infinite tape, infinite in both directions, then that can be simulated by a Turing machine with a semi-infinite tape, right? Which means that if you have a language which is accepted by a Turing machine, right, with an infinite tape, infinite in both directions, then there also exists another Turing machine which can accept that language with a semi-infinite tape. Okay. So the way that we come up with this with this Turing machine with the semi-infinite tape, right, which simulates a Turing machine with infinite tape, is that we basically fold the infinite tape right into. So this means that diagrammatically, right, uh, the top. So we say that this Turing machine with semi-infinite tape, right, is going to have two tracks now. So we define this notion of a track, right? So a track of a Turing machine. So if the tape of the Turing machine has multiple tracks, then that basically means that the alphabet, right, has basically multiple dimensions, right? So that any symbol, right, of the alphabet of this Turing machine, right, which has say two tracks, is going to be a vector of two dimensions. Right? So it's going to have two components. Okay. Which means that every square, right, in this tape basically has two components. Okay. So the top track, right, basically is the tape in the in the direction, the increasing direction, right? So that's towards the right of the initial the leftmost symbol the in the input string, right? While the bottom track are the contains the positions which are to the left of the leftmost symbol of the input string. Okay. So we basically denote this positions, right, by numbers here. So the number 0 is uh, the leftmost symbol in the input string, and then you have 1, 2, 3, so on, right? And the so immediately below 0, right, we have this special marker called star. Right? Right. So this star is a special marker. It's not part of the input alphabet, right? It's part of the tape alphabet. And then we have this. They have the positions -1, -2, -3, and so on, which are to the left of the leftmost symbol, right? And in order to know, right, that whether or not the position of the read head, right, so whether or not we're actually reading the upper track or the lower track, we also store this information as part of the state. Okay? So the state remembers whether you're simulating the upper or the lower track, right? And so we need to reverse the directions for lower track, right? So we'll see this reversal using an example, right? So in the very first move of so we are talking about how to design this Turing machine with a semi-infinite tape, right? Which is going to simulate a Turing machine with an infinite tape, right? So we are given a Turing machine, right, with an infinite tape, okay, which is infinite in both directions, right? And we are trying to define. So we know all the states of that Turing machine. We know the tape alphabet of that infinite tape Turing machine, and we know the transitions of that infinite tape Turing machine. Right. So we're trying to define now the states, the symbols, the input and the tape alphabet, as well as the transitions of the semi-infinite Turing machine. Right. So the states and the alphabets are straightforward, right? So the state would just be the states of the original Turing machine, along with this upper or this upper or lower track symbol, right, that we introduce. Okay, and now we are trying to define the and similarly the tape alphabet would just be basically the tape alphabet of the original Turing machine multiplied with itself, right? So cross product of this, because it's not two-dimensional. So we are trying to define now the transitions of this semi-infinite tape Turing machine, right? So in the very first transition, right, we are going to put a star. So remember that the input, right, is basically going to be here, right? So the input is going to be in the upper track, and initially, right, the read head is going to point to the first position, right, the leftmost position in this semi-infinite tape. Okay? So in the very first transition, I'm going to simply put a star in the first position of the lower track. Okay? And now we can define other transitions of the new semi-infinite tape Turing machine, right? So in particular, if in the original Turing machine, right, let's say we had this transition, which says that if you are in state Q and you read the tape alphabet, the symbol X, right, then you move to state P, you replace X with Y, and then you move the tape head in the direction P. Okay. So in the new Turing machine, right, let's say that the second component of the state was U, which means that we are basically in the upper track here. So if you are in the upper track, and if your state is q, right, and if the the symbol on the tape, right, which is in the upper track is x. So we don't care what is the symbol in the lower track, right? So essentially there is a for all z here. Right? So for all z, we basically introduce this particular transition, right, which says that the state q is now going to change to p. We are going to remain in the upper track, right, and we will replace x with y. Right? The z will remain the same, and you will move the tape head in the same direction as d. So so diagrammatically, if let's say if d was r, right, then you basically changed the state to p. The tape alphabet has changed to y, or rather the symbol on the tape has changed to y, and you moved the tape head to the right by 1 square, right? Uh, Now let's consider the second case, right, where suppose you were in the lower track, right? So in this case, the second component in the state is L, which means you are in the lower track. So here we are then interested in what is there in the lower track of the tape, right? So if the lower track of the tape contains X, right, we don't care what is in the upper track of the tail, or we don't care what's there in the upper track of the tape, right? So which means that there is also another for all z here, okay? And so in this case, I'm going to change the state to q. I'm going to remain in the lower track, right? So I will change the state to p rather. I will remain in the lower track, and I'm going to replace whatever is there in the lower track, right, which is this x with y. But the direction is going to be reversed, right? So here d bar is the reverse of d, right? Which means if in the original Turing machine, right, you had to move to the right, right, then in this newer Turing machine, right, you would basically move to the left. Okay? So if you are moving to the right, in the original Turing machine, it basically means that you are moving closer to zero, right? That's why you will move to the left in the new Turing machine, right? But on the other hand, if you are moving to the left in the original Turing machine, then which means you are actually moving away from the position zero. Right? So that's why you will move to the right in the new Turing machine. Right? So in particular, right? So in this case, if d was r, right, which means you are moving to the right, since you are moving closer to the position zero. So then you will change the tape head one position to the right, one position to the left, rather. So it's the opposite of d. Okay. Uh, yeah, and you also need to worry about this case where you are in here, right? And you have to change, for example, from the upper track to the lower track, or the lower track to the upper track, right? So you need special transitions for those cases as well. But you can, but I won't go through them here, right? So you can look this up in the textbook, right? About how to handle this case of changing the track. Right? So that's why we actually put this star symbol, right, in order to find out where we are, right, and whether or not we need to change the track or not. Right? So this is how, given the description of the infinite tape Turing machine, I can come up with a description of or I can construct this semi-infinite tape Turing machine, which simulates the infinite tape Turing machine. So therefore, yeah, I don't need a Turing machine with infinite in both directions. So is this are there any questions regarding this construction? So now let's look at some extensions of the standard Turing machine model, right? So in restriction, right, you basically reduce the power, right? So you say that, okay, instead of infinite in both directions, I only have infinite in one direction, right? But in an extension, you add more power to the Turing machine, right? So this is more general than the standard Turing machine model, right? And we will see, right, that even though you may add more power, right, to the Turing machine, it doesn't really affect the language recognition capability of the Turing machine, right? Which means that even though you add these extensions, right, uh, you don't really get something that's more powerful than the standard TM. So which means that this sort of extensions of the Turing machine are only able to define the RE, or the recursively enumerable languages. So which means that if you have a language, right, and if you actually define, right, or if you actually come up with a Turing machine which is more powerful than the general model, right? More powerful in these three senses, right, that I have just mentioned on the slide. Then it doesn't really matter, right? So you can construct a standard Turing machine with just a single infinite tape, which is also going to accept the same language, right? So the three extensions that we'll consider, right? So in fact, the third one I'm going to leave as the reading exercise. I only covered the first two. So these are multi-tape Turing machines and non-deterministic Turing machines. So, so in a multi-tape Turing machine, instead of a single tape, you have multiple tapes, right? And in a non-deterministic Turing machine, you allow non-determinism. So these Turing machines are no more powerful than the standard Turing machine. So let's look at a multi-tape Turing machine. Right? So there is a difference between. So we said that we have earlier seen Turing machines with multiple tracks, right? So there is a difference between multiple tracks and multiple tapes, right? Because in a multi-track Turing machine, right, it's true that you have this multiple tracks, right, where you can store different symbols, right? But there is only one read head, right? And at the and you can, and basically you have to so you have to move, right, along this multiple tracks in a synchronized manner, right? So it's not like you can be in one position in one track and another position in another track and so on, right? But in a multi-tape Turing machine, you basically have multiple tapes, right? Which means you also have multiple read heads. So you can move these read heads independently on the different tapes. Okay. So we basically so in a multi-tape Turing machine, we allow the Turing machine to have some k number of tapes for a fixed key. Okay. And the move of the Turing machine is going to depend on the state and the symbols under the head for each tape, right? So each tape is going to have its own head, and so basically the move of the Turing machine will depend on its state, right, and the symbols that are present under the head for each tape, right? And in one move, the Turing machine can change the state. It writes symbols under each head, and it moves each head independently, right? So this is very similar to what we do in a standard Turing machine with just one tape, right? So in one tape, in a one-tape Turing machine, you can basically change the state, and you can replace whatever was there under that read head, right? And then you can move the read head. Well, here you can do the same thing for each tape in an independent fashion, right? So more formally, right, transition function delta of such a multi-tape Turing machine can be defined as follows, right? So you will basically have the state q, right, and the symbols that are present x1 up to xk under the read head of each tape, right? And then depending on the state and the symbols, right, you can change the state to p, right? And you can replace all of those symbols that are present under the read head with y1 to yk, and you can also move the read heads independently, right? So this d1 to dk are the directions in which you can move the read head, right? So here we also allow one more capability, which is that these directions, right, so they can be either left, right, or s, where s stands for stationary, which means that we may actually not move the read head at all for something. So we allow the head at a tape to remain stationary, right? So it seems that at first glance, right, you can store more information, right, in a multi-tape Turing machine, and you can. It seems that it's adding more power, right, because you can. So you are able to store more information, right? So and you are able to manipulate information, right, in a more powerful fashion, right? So it's like when we moved from a push-down automaton to a Turing machine, right? So remember, then the push-down automaton also, we had infinite storage, right, which was in the form of this stack, right? So I can push as many elements as I want on the stack, right? But the only restriction was how I operate the stack, right? So I can only look at what is there on the top of the stack, and once I look at what is there on the top of the stack, I have to remove it. Okay. So when we moved from a push-down automaton to a Turing machine, we basically increased our capability, right, of how to handle this infinite storage, right? So instead of a stack, we now have a tape, right, which I can basically read and write in any location, right, on this tape. Okay. So now it seems that I'm adding one more capability, which is that instead of a single tape, I have multiple tapes, right? And I can store as much information as I want on this tape, and I can read and write independently from any of these tapes. Right? So even though it looks like we are adding more power, it's not the case, right? And such a multi-tape Turing machine can be simulated by a single Turing machine, by a single tape Turing machine. So we can simulate k tapes by one, and so the main idea is very simple, right? So we just use tracks, right, in order to keep track of these tapes, right? So for each tape, we are going to have a separate track, right, of the Turing machine, of the single tape Turing machine, right? And we also need to store information about where the head is, right? So unlike in a k track Turing machine, right, where there would just be one head, in a k tape Turing machine we'll have k heads, right? So to keep track of this, where the head is in each tape, we use another track, right? So that's why we use two k tracks. So each tape of the k tape machine is represented by a track, and the head position for each track is represented on another track, right? So we use a mark on an additional track in order to represent the head position for each tape. So looking at it through a picture, right? So let's say you have k equal to 2, which means you have a 2 tape Turing machine. So if you are trying to simulate this using a 1 tape Turing machine, then this 1 tape Turing machine is going to have a tape with 4 tracks, right? Where this tape 1 and tape 2, right? So these are the tracks which actually store the information, right? Which actually store the contents of the tape 1 and tape 2, right? And then we have two tracks for maintaining the head position. So and these tracks for maintaining the position of the read head will store a marker, right, in order to denote where exactly is the head, right? So here, for example, right, so whenever we have this X marker, so it means that this head is here and this head is in this position. Okay. And this one tape Turing machine, right, itself is going to have just a single read head, right? So this will be the single read head of that one tape Turing machine. So now that we have described how we are going to store the information, right? We can then look at the transitions of this one tape Turing machine, right? So again, it's very straightforward, right? So if you want to simulate a move of the k tape Turing machine, then the one tape Turing machine, right, needs to know what is the state first of all, and what are the symbols under each of the under each of the read heads in the k tapes, right? So for this, the one tape Turing machine is basically going to visit each of the marked elements on the k tracks, right? So the one tape Turing machine, right, keeps track of how many head markers are there to the left of its current position, right? So that it basically visits all of those head markers, right? So for each of the k tapes, it's going to visit what are the elements which are present in the marked positions, right? And it's going to store that as these marked symbols as part of its state, right? So remember that whenever it visits, let's say, the mark symbol on one of the tapes, right? Then it needs to store that information, right? Because it also needs to look at the mark symbols on the second tape, on the third tape, and so on, right? So all of these will be stored as part of its state, right? So the state also is going to be a vector now, okay? And once it knows all of the once it knows all of the k symbols, then it knows the transition that should be made by that would be made by the k tape machine, right? So it knows the state and it knows what are the symbols under each of the k read heads. So it knows what is the transition. So then it has to simulate the transition, right? So again, it's very straightforward, right? So so this one tape Turing machine is going to again visit each of the k each of the read heads, right, on the k tapes, right? And on the k tracks rather, right? And it's going to change the symbol under the read heads, and it's also going to move the read head by changing the position of the marker itself, right? So to simulate this transition, it visits each of the marked elements, possibly replaces them, and then it moves the mark, and it also records the state change of the k tape machine. So you can see that we are doing a lot of work, right? So this one tape Turing machine, right, has to do a lot of work in order to simulate even a single move of the k-tape Turing machine. Right? But it's still a finite number of steps. Right? So it's not like we are entering a loop or something, right? And so the time complexity obviously increases, but we can do this. Right? So in the sense that a one-tape Turing machine can simulate a k-tape Turing machine. So are there any questions regarding this construction? So let's look at another extension of the standard Turing machine model, which is the non-deterministic Turing machine. Right? So the standard Turing machine is deterministic, right? So which means that for every combination, right, of a state uh, and a symbol, right, which is present under the read head, right? I only have so it's either undefined or I have a single element here, right, which is of the form, let's say, p, y, and t. But in a non-deterministic Turing machine, I'm not going to have a choice of such triples, right? So which means that uh, there are a set of moves, right, that a Turing machine can make, right, for some given state and some given symbol under its read head, right? And the Turing machine can choose one of these moves to make. So in a non-deterministic TM, we allow the TM to have a choice of move at each step. So, and each step is a state symbol direction triple. So each choice is a state symbol direction triple, just like the deterministic Turing machine. Right? So instead of just a single choice, right, now we are going to have multiple such choices. Okay. And so how do we define the acceptance criterion? So it's similar to how we defined the acceptance criterion for, say, a non-deterministic finite automaton or a PDA, right, which is also non-deterministic. Right? It's that if there exists some sequence of choices that leads the Turing machine, right, to an accepting or a final state, then that the input is accepted. Otherwise, so if for all choices of uh, for all choices at every step, right? If the Turing machine either goes to a non-final state or it loops, then it won't be accepted. So yes, so this is the definition of a non-deterministic Turing machine. And now the question is that is this more powerful than the deterministic component? Right? So in the sense that are there languages which are accepted by non-deterministic Turing machine but cannot be accepted by a deterministic Turing machine? Right? So we saw that for the finite state automaton, right, it is not the case that non-determinism adds more power, right? But for a push-down automaton, right, non-determinism added more power, right? But here again, in the case of Turing machines, non-determinism doesn't add more power. So in the sense that if there is a non-deterministic TM for a language, then there also exists a deterministic TM for that language, right? And we can simulate a non-deterministic Turing machine by a deterministic Turing machine, right? So in a deterministic Turing machine, you only have one choice, right? So how would you actually simulate a non-deterministic Turing machine with a deterministic Turing machine? So the idea is that you basically store the configurations, right? Each configuration, right? So remember that each choice that a non-deterministic Turing machine has at a step, right, leads to a new configuration, right? So configuration is nothing but the state of the Turing machine along with the components of the tape. Okay, so each choice is going to lead to a separate configuration, and at every step, right, this deterministic Turing machine is basically going to store all of the configurations that can or that would come up because of the choices, right? So for each choice there is a separate configuration, and the deterministic Turing machine is going to store all of those configurations. So remember that every configuration is finite, right? Because a configuration, right, is of the form alpha q beta, right, where this q is the state, right, and this alpha and beta are the tape components, right? So in particular, so this alpha beta is the are the contents of the tape between the leftmost non-blank and the rightmost non-blank, right? And this is guaranteed to be finite, okay? Because in a finite number of steps, you can only visit a finite number of squares, right? uh, and this queue, right? So the position of the queue indicates the position of the read head, right? So all of these configurations are going to be stored by the deterministic Turing machine. So the DTM maintains on its tape a queue of configurations of the non-deterministic Turing machine. So this queue is important, right? Because if it were any other data structure other than a queue, then it won't work, right? So let's see how exactly the DTM works. Okay. So this DTM also uses a second track in order to mark certain positions, right? So in particular, there's a mark for the configuration which is at the head of the queue, right? So at every step, right, the DTM is basically going to look at the configuration at the head of the queue, and then then it's going to look at the next step, right, that the non-deterministic Turing machine can take from that configuration. So there could be a set of a set of moves, right, or a set of choices at that point, right? So for each choice, we will get a new configuration. So the DTM will basically copy this new configuration, right, right, corresponding to each of the choices, and it's going to enqueue them, right? So it's basically going to add them at the end, right? So here is the picture of the DTM table. Okay, so as you can see, right, so there's this track. So we use this notation ID, right, for the configuration, right? So ID0 is one configuration. Let's say it's the initial configuration, right, which is going to be of the form Q and then W. Right? So where this Q0 is going to be Q0 and W, where Q0 will be the initial state and W is the input string. Okay. And then from that initial configuration, right, new configurations would have resulted. Right? So all of those configurations are stored on this track. Okay, so ID1 is another configuration, and so on. Right? And this hash is the special symbol that's used, that's not part of the input alphabet, and that is used to in order to demarcate the different configurations. Okay, and along with this, there is another track, and in this track, we simply store what is or we simply mark the position of the current configuration that we are visiting, right? That the DTM is visiting, right? And there is another marker which is only used when you are making a move, right? So when you are making a move of the non-deterministic Turing machine, which means we have to create a new configuration. And so whenever we have to create a new configuration, we have to copy we have to copy most of the components from the original configuration, right? So that's where the second marker will be used. Okay, so in this picture, right, for example, the DTM is basically analyzing the configuration IDK, right, because that's where the X marker is, right? So that's the new configuration. So it's the front of the queue, or it's the DQ end of the queue, right? And whatever new configuration, right, that would be resulted because of one step of the non-deterministic Turing machine from this configuration IDK. So this is the new ID, right? So this will be copied at the end, right, at the NQ end of this particular queue. Okay, and in order to make this copy, you will use this marker Y. Okay, so this is the general picture of how the DTM is going to simulate the NTM. Okay. So as I said before, right, so in order to simulate each move made by the NTM, right, the DTM will basically find the configuration or the ID at the current front of the queue. Okay, and then so given the configuration, right, so this configuration is going to be of the form alpha, q, and beta, right? So it needs to find the state. Okay, so it looks for the state in that ID, and then from the state, right, we know that the symbol that's to the immediate left of the state is the current symbol under the read head of the non-deterministic TM. So from the state, it knows from the state, and the symbol to the left of that of the state, it knows, right, what is the next step, or what is the set of next steps that the non-deterministic TM can make. So it looks for the state in that ID, so that it can determine the moves that are permitted from that ID. And so there could be many moves, right? So if there are m possible moves, right, where remember that in each move, right, the NTM may change the state, it may change the symbol under the read head, and it may change the position of the read head, right? So these are the only things that it can do, right? But there could be many such things that it can do, and therefore for each of these moves, there could be m new configurations. So if there are m possible moves, then there could be m new configurations, and each of these configurations are then stored by the DTM at the rear of the queue. So one for each move. Okay. And then it sort of moves forward, right? So then it will look at the next ID in the queue, right? And again it will do the same thing. Right? So the m new IDs are created one at a time, and after all of them are created, the marker for the front of the queue is moved one ID toward the rear of the queue, right? Which means it's then going to process the next configuration in the queue. Okay. However, if the NTM moves to a configuration where the state is an accepting state or the final state, then the DTM will also accept, right? And it will halt. Right? Otherwise, it will keep on doing this. Okay. So note that what we are essentially doing, right, is that we are we are basically exploring, right, all the possible all the possible choices, right, that the NTM can make at every step, right, when it's processing a string. But we are doing this in a breadth first manner, right, which means that so we look at all the choices that the NTM can make in the first step, okay, and then we look at all the choices that the NTM can make in the second step, and then in the third step, and so on, right? So that's why we have this this queue structure, right? Whereby so whenever we get a new configuration, right, we add it at the end of the queue. So such a new configuration is going to be processed only after all the previous configurations have been processed. Right? So this particular construction, right, or this this sort of way of storing the IDs, right, is crucial to the correctness of this construction. So why the NTM to the DTM construction works, right? So let's say that so what we want, right, is that whenever the NTM reaches an accepting state, right? So whenever the NTM accepts a string, then I know that there is some there was some sequence of choices, right, at every step that led to the NTM reaching an accepting state, right? And we want to show that the DTM, right, would also find out that that correct sequence of choices at every step in order to reach the accepting state itself, right? So let's say that there is an so let's see why the DTM would do that, right? So first, let's assume that there is an upper bound on the number of choices or the moves of the NTM for any state symbol combination, right? So which means that for some so we basically look at this delta of q comma x, right, for all q and for all x of the NTM, right, and we find out what is the size of the maximum such set, right? So each delta qx is a set now. So we find the set with the maximum cardinality, and this is guaranteed to be finite, right? Because there are only a finite number of moves, right? There are only finite combinations of state and symbol, right? So let's say that there is this upper bound k on the number of choices of the move of NTM for any state symbol combination. Okay. So then we can say that any configuration that is reachable from the initial configuration by n moves of the NTM, this is going to be constructed by the DTM after constructing at most so many number of configurations, right? So what is this number? Right? So this number is nothing but the sum of k plus k square plus dot 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 up to kn. Right? So what we are saying, right, is that let's say that after n moves, right, of the NTM, the NTM reaches an accepting configuration, right? So then at each of those n moves, right? So if you look at the first move, then there are k possible choices, right? If you look at the second move, then there can be at most k choices. If you look at the third move, there could be at most k choices, and so on, right? So if you look at the number of IDs, right, that are reachable after let's say some I number of steps, right? So it's nothing. So it's going to be k to the power I, right? Because after the first step, there could be k possible configurations, right? Then after the second step, right? So each of those configurations among the k will have its own k, at most k moves, right? Which means at most k configurations, right? So that's why you have k square number of configurations after the second step, and then each of those k squares configurations can have can have k more configurations, right? So we'll have k cube configurations after the 3 steps and so on, right? So after n steps, we can have at most kn number of configurations, right? And remember that this deterministic TM is going to store all of those configurations, right? So it's basically going to store, let's say, the first k configurations, then the next k square configurations, then the next k cube configurations, and so on, right? So which means that this DTM, right, is basically guaranteed to reach the accepting configuration, right, after constructing at most k plus k square plus dot 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 up to kn configurations of the NTM. Yeah. So basically, if the NTM accepts, then it does so in some sequence of n choices of moves, and the ID with an accepting state will be constructed by the DTM in some large number of moves of its own. So as you can see, right, again, the DTM may take an exponential number of moves, right, in order to find that particular accepting state, but it will do it, right, and it will do it in a finite amount of time as well. So if the NTM does not accept, right, in the sense that if it either goes to a non-final state, right, for each of the for each sequence, right, or for each sequence of choices, right, or if it loops, then the DTM will also do the same, right. In which case, the DTM will also not accept. Okay. So yes, so that's how any non-deterministic Turing machine can be simulated by a deterministic Turing machine. Right. So, any questions regarding this construction? Okay. So we can now take advantage of these two extensions that we have seen, right? So basically, whenever we discuss the construction of particular TMs that take other TMs as input, right? So we'll see this particular type of construction in the next lecture, right? So then we can assume that this input TM is as simple as possible, right? So we are talking about constructing a TM which takes another TM as input, right? So now this input TM, right, this could be as simple as possible, right? So it could be, for example, a TM with semi-infinite, just one semi-infinite tape, and it is deterministic, right? But this TM that we are constructing, right, which takes other TMs as input, that TM can be as complex as possible, right? So in the sense that you can have as much power as possible. So it could be not deterministic, it could have multiple tapes and so on. So the simulating TM can have many tapes, be non-deterministic, etc. Okay. So we have said that a Turing machine is the most powerful computing abstraction. Right? So which means that if you look at a real computer, right? If you look at your laptop, right? If you look at your desktop, right? Then anything that these real computers can do, the Turing machine can also do, right? So in fact, right, so the Turing machine can actually do much more than what a real computer can do, right? Because a real computer has finite memory, while a Turing machine actually has an infinite amount of memory, right? So this means that so basically you can also simulate a real computer, right? The actions of a real computer using a Turing machine, right? So we have already seen, right, in the last lecture, right, that how a Turing machine can simulate or can perform basic arithmetic operations, right, like addition, subtraction, multiplication, and so on, right? So if you look at a real computer, right, so a real computer has this arithmetic and logical processing unit, right? It's the ALU, right? So each of the instructions in the ALU can be performed by the Turing machine, right? And a real computer would also have this random access memory, right? So this is the second component that the real computer has, right? Which is this memory, which so it can basically ask what is the value at any location of this memory. Right? So we can so here, right, we can also show how a Turing machine can simulate this memory. Right? So basically, if you have an infinite store of name value pairs, right? So that's what the address space of a computer is, right? So it's basically for every location, what is the value at that location, right? So the name is basically the location address, right? And the value is the value at that location. And a Turing machine can also simulate such an infinite name value pair, which means an infinite address space, right? So we know that the Turing machine can process or rather the Turing machine can simulate all the operations, right? The arithmetic operations, and can also simulate the memory itself, right? So that means that the Turing machine can also simulate a computer. So obviously, again, it's going to be much more computationally expensive, right? Since that the Turing machine will take a large number of steps to just simulate one step of a computer, but it's still a finite number of steps, right? And it can be done. So I won't go through this construction, right? So it's very straightforward, and so I'm going to leave this as a reading exercise, right? So you can take a look at it. Okay. So now let's also briefly look at closure properties of recursive and RE languages. So remember that closure properties, we are basically asking the question that if you perform operations like union, intersection, complementation, and so on, right? So are the recursive and RE languages closed under these operations? Okay. So let's first give a summary, right, of all of the closure properties, right? So both recursive and RE languages are closed under union, concatenation, star, reversal, intersection, and inverse homomorphism. But on the other hand, right, so the recursive languages are closed under difference and complementation, but the recursively enumerable languages are not closed under difference and complementation, right? So which means that so what does this mean, right? So this means that if you basically have recursively enumerable language, right, and if you take its complement, right, then it need not necessarily be recursively enumerable, right? Which means that that's actually one way of having a language which is not recursively enumerable, right? So which doesn't have any Turing machine which defines it. And similarly, if you have two recursively enumerable languages and take the difference, it need not be recursively enumerable. On the other hand, this recursively enumerable languages are closed under homomorphism, but recursive languages are not closed under homomorphism. So I'll just give a sort of a brief idea, right, of how to show this closure properties, right, and then again you can take a look at more details, right. So let's first look at union, right. So we're talking about taking union of let's say you have two Turing machines, M1 and M2, and they define languages L1 and L2, and we want to find out whether or not L1 union L2, right, that does there exist a Turing machine for L1 union L2. So we can assume that M1 and M2 are both single semi-infinite tape Turing machines, right? So what we'll do, right, is that so we'll basically so we'll now construct a Turing machine M for the language L1 union L2, right? And this Turing machine M is basically going to have two tapes, right? So we are going to copy the input, right? So we are going to copy the input on both the tapes, right? And then we are going to simply run both of these Turing machines M1 and M2 on the two tapes, right? So M1 is going to run in the first tape and M2 is going to run in the second tape. So they will basically run in parallel, right? So they need not even run in parallel, right? So they can run one after the other as well. So yeah, so we'll basically simulate the two Turing machines M1 and M2 on parallel, right, on each of the two tapes, right? So we can do this because as I said, right, so a two-tape Turing machine is similar in power to a one-tape Turing machine, right? So it's just a more convenient way of constructing a TM, right? So now right, so now that I am running this this two-tape Turing machine, right? So if either of the if either of the two Turing machines accept the string, then the original Turing machine will also accept it, right? Because this is the union that we're talking about. While if both of them reject, then this new Turing machine M will also reject, right? So for recursive languages, if M1 and M2 are both recursive, right, which means they're both algorithms and they're both total TMs, then both this M1 and M2 are guaranteed to halt, right? Which means that M will also always halt, right? So this means that the resulting Turing machine M is also an algorithm, right? It's also total, and therefore the language of M is also is also recursive. Right? On the other hand, if you have a recursively enumerable language, then both of these Turing machines, right, may M1 and M2 may actually run right without halting or accepting, but that's fine, right? So the result will be a recursively enumerable language still. So diagrammatically, right? So we have these two Turing machines M1 and M2. So given on the same input, right? Uh, we basically make two copies and we run both of them in parallel. And then if so, in the case of a recursive language, right? If either of them accept, then I accept, and if both of them reject, right? Then I'm going to reject. Okay. While in the case of a recursively enumerable language, if either of them accept, right, then I'm going to accept. So I don't care when either of the two Turing machines M1 and M2 reject, right? So it may happen that they may run forever, right, or they may actually halt, right? But I don't care. Right? So in that case, I can either run forever or I can halt, right? So it's basically it doesn't matter, right? Because a recursively enumerable language only enforces constraint that whenever you accept, you must halt, right? So whenever you reject, then you can either loop forever, right, or you can halt as well, or you can halt in a non-final state. So in this case, we are not really halting, right? So this M will halt only if either of the two machines halt and accept. And for intersection, we basically have the same idea, right? So here, if both of the machines accept, then only I'm going to accept. Right? Otherwise, if either of the two machines reject, then I'm going to reject. And same goes for recursively enumerable as well. And so as I said, this recursive, so with respect to difference and complementation, the recursive and the recursively enumerable languages behave differently, right? So in particular, if you take the difference of two, so let's say that you are trying to design a TM for difference. Right? So you're given a TM for both L1 and L2, right? So you will again run both of them on parallel. But now, if you want to find out the difference, right, then one of them, let's say M1 should accept it and M2 should reject it. So in the case of a recursive language, you are sure, right, that that basically M2 is going to halt, right, whenever it rejects, and therefore at that point I can accept. Right? So that's why recursive languages are closed under complementation. Right? But in the case of a recursively enumerable language, right, even if M1 accepts, right, if M2 does not accept, then you don't know, right, because M2 may actually run forever. Right? So you don't know how. So you can't say in a finite number of steps, right, whether or not M2 is going to accept this string or not, right? So you need to know whether or not M2 accepts, right? Because you need to find the difference, right? So that's why recursively enumerable languages are not closed under difference, right? And that's why they are not closed under complementation as well. Okay. Yeah. So there are the other closure properties as well, like concatenation and homomorphism and inverse homomorphism, but star as well and reversal. But again, right, so I'm going to leave this as a reading exercise, so you can take a look at it and look at the different constructions for the different closure properties. Okay. Yeah. So I'm out of time, so I'm going to end the lecture here, and yeah, thank you everyone.